In this video, we're going to be taking a look at common denominators and equivalent fractions. Now, the essential question that we are going to answer is how can you rewrite a pair of fractions so that they have a common denominator? Now, you will need to turn to page 255 in your Go Math book. Get out your pencil, obviously your Go Math book, and also your math journal. Okay, so we have the problem. Sarah planted two 1-acre gardens. One had 3 sections of flowers and the other had 4 sections of flowers. She plans to divide both gardens into more sections so that they have the same number of equal-sized sections. How many sections will each garden have? Now, you can use a common denominator or a common multiple of 2 or more denominators to write fractions that have the same part of a whole. Okay, so what we have here are the fractions of 1/3 and 1/4. So what we need to do is we have to figure out how to get a common denominator for both of these. Okay, so what we need to think about that we need to divide each 1/3 into fourths and divide each 1/4 into thirds. Okay, so what I mean by that, we're taking each of these 1/3 and we're dividing them into fourths, just like this. So each one, that's what we're doing, okay, for each of these. And the 1/4, we're dividing each of these into 1/3. Okay, so that's what I mean by that. Whoops, actually did fourths there. Let me do thirds. So just 2 lines for thirds there. I know not completely equal, but you can see that's what we're doing for each of these. Okay. And I want you to do this in your book as well. A little straighter than I'm doing it, but you get the idea here. And then each of these into thirds. So just 2 lines for thirds. So that's what we're thinking here. Alright, now what we can see is that each section now is divided up into 12 sections. Okay, I should say each of these sections here, 12 sections and 12 sections. Alright, so what we could do, we could even multiply the denominators to find a common denominator. Okay, so what we see here is that we have a common denominator of 3 and 4. Multiply the denominators. 3 times 4 is 12. Write 1/3 and 1/4 as equivalent fractions using the common denominator. Okay, so since we multiplied that denominator by 4, so the opposite denominator, what we do to the numerator, we have to do the denominator. So we multiplied that 3 by 4, so we have to multiply that numerator by 4 as well, giving us 4/12. Multiply that denominator by 3, you have to multiply that numerator by 3 as well, giving us 3/12. Alright, so we can see here both gardens have 12 sections. Okay, so we can see that we divided the 1/3 into fourths, the 1/4 into thirds. We also multiplied by the opposite denominator, giving us the common denominator of 12. Okay, so another thing that we can do is make a list of the first 8 non-zero multiples of 3 and 4. Okay, and then what we can do is we can figure out the least common multiple. Okay, so we have, what we do is just basically skip count. Alright, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21, and 24. We have 4. You always start with the original number. 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24, 28, and 32. Now, there's nothing really magical about the number 8, first 8 non-zero multiples, but usually with the first 8 you can probably find a common multiple here. Okay, so what we can do, we can compare lists. We have a 12 and a 12, and then moving on down we have a 24 and 24. So 12 and 24 are common multiples. We want to find the least common multiple, in other words, the least amount common multiple, which is 12. Okay, so use one of the common multiples as a common denominator to write equivalent fractions of 1/3 and 1/4. Okay, so 1/3 we can see is equal to 4/12. Okay, so it's 12 my denominator. If that's going to be my multiple, we need to figure out what we're doing to 3 to get to 12. We multiply it by 4, so you multiply the numerator by 4 as well. Okay, so that denominator again is going to be 12. We need to think about what do we do to 4 in order to make it a 12. We multiplied by 3, so you have to multiply the numerator by 3 as well. Now let's say, for example, we are taking a look at 24 as the common multiple. Now that's not the least common multiple. I always recommend you using the least common multiple. Okay, but let's say we use 24 as the common denominator. So we have 24 there. Think about what did you do to 3 to make it to 24? You multiplied by 8. What you do to the denominator, you must do to the numerator. You multiply that 1 by 8, giving you 8 over 24. Once again, with my 1/4, making that denominator a 4. What did you do to that 4 to get it to 24? You multiplied by 6. So you multiply that numerator by 6 as well. Okay, so we can see that both gardens can have 12 or 24 sections. Okay, but I do recommend when you're finding common denominators that you use the least common multiple. Okay, let's take a look at the example problem on page 256. It says find the least common denominator. This is another way of doing it. Use the least common denominator, kind of what I just showed you previously. So it says find the least common denominator of 3/4 and 1/6. Use the least common denominator to write an equivalent fraction for each fraction. Okay, so the first thing we want to do, we want to list non-zero multiples of the denominators and then find the least common multiple. Okay, so we'll start with 8. The first 8 of these: 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24, 28, and 32. You just skip count. So with 6, 12, 18, 24, 30, 36, 42, and 48. So the first 8 non-zero multiples, pretty easy to see that you'll probably be able to figure out or be able to see a common multiple. But if you don't, that's okay. You just keep on going. Okay, so from here, what we do is find the least common multiple. We compare our list. 4 and 6, not there. 8, not there. 12 and 12. Okay, so that is the first one we come to. All right, so we can say that the least common denominator of 3/4 and 1/6, this is how you find the least common denominator, is 12. You start out by the first 8 non-zero multiples of each number and then look for common multiples. If not, keep going. Okay, but you want to find the least common multiple. Least, in other words, it's the first one that comes in the list. Common multiple, they're in both lists. Okay, so we could see the least common denominator now of 3/4 and 1/6 is 12. Okay, now we can't just say that, we can't just change the denominator to 12 for both of these. What we have to do is we have to change also the numerator. Okay, think about the numerator and denominator as being very jealous of each other. They want to be fair. They want everything to be equal. So whatever you do to the numerator, you must do to the denominator and vice versa. Okay, so if we're changing that denominator to 12, what we need to figure out is what do we do to 4 in order to make it a 12? We multiply that by 3. So we have to multiply the numerator by 3. 3 times 3 is 9. 4 times 3 is 12. Think about that 6. What do we do to that 6 in order to make it a 12? We multiplied it by 2. So since we multiplied the denominator by 2, we must multiply the numerator by 2. Both numerator and denominator. 1 times 2 is 2. 6 times 2 is 12. So if we're using a common denominator of 3/4 and 1/6, okay, 3/4 must be written as 9/12, and 1/6 must be written as 2/12. Okay, so we can see if you're multiplying the denominators, this is another way that we've already talked about, that you can find a common denominator. You can multiply by opposite denominators. Okay, so in other words, we're going to multiply that 6 by 9 because that's the opposite denominator. 6 times 9 is 54. Since we multiplied the denominator by 9, we must multiply the numerator by 9, which 1 times 9 is 9. Okay, now we need to multiply this 1/9 by the opposite denominator, which is 6. Multiply that 9 by 54. 9 times 6, which gives us 54. Multiply that numerator times 6, which will give us 6. So we can see that a common denominator of 1/6 and 1/9 is 54. Is that the least common denominator? It is not, but that is a common denominator. And it's important to know that finding a common denominator is very easy and just multiplying by the opposite denominator. But finding the least common denominator, it's important to go through the steps that we went through when we were listing the multiples. Now I want you to work through this problem. I just want you to find the common denominator between these two. And when you're finished, I do want you to write out the new fraction, not just the denominator. And when you're finished, you can press play. I will have the answer for you. Pause the video now. Okay, the answer is 20 for the common denominator. You can see that we multiplied that 5 by 4, giving us 20. Multiplied the 3 by 4, gave us 12. Multiplied 1/4 by 5, both numerator and denominator, giving us 5/20. Let's take a look at this next one. I want you to work through it and find the common denominator. When you're finished, you can press play. I will have the answer for you. So pause the video now. Okay, here's the answer to this problem. Common denominator 40. The new fractions 25/40ths and 8/40ths. Okay, I want you to find the common denominator of these two fractions. When you're finished, you can press play. I will have the answer for you. So pause the video now. Okay, there can actually be two answers that I will accept. The common denominator would be 12. Whenever the denominator that's less can go equally into the other denominator, you can make that the common denominator. But if you just multiply it by opposite denominators, it can also be 24 as well. Now I don't have these on my screen, but I want you to do numbers 11, 12, and 13. I want you to find the least common denominator for both of these. Remember, that's when you list the multiples. When you're finished, you can press play. I will have the answers for you. So find the least common denominators and pause the video now. Okay, here are the answers for 11, 12, and 13. Remember, you needed to list those multiples and find the least common multiple, which will also give you the least common denominator. If you did not get these correct, I want you to rewind the video, take a look at how I found the least common denominator. Okay, now let's move on to the test prep problem. I want you to work this problem out. When you're finished, you can press play. I will have the answer for you. So pause the video now. Okay, the answer is letter B. And moving to the essential question, how can you rewrite a pair of fractions so that they have a common denominator? You can see the answer to this. I want you to read through it. And it's very, very important that finding a common denominator and the least common denominator are, you need to go about it two separate ways. You can go about it the same way if you're using the list of multiples, but very important, least common denominator, you have to list the multiples of each denominator. So this concludes the video on common denominators and equivalent fractions. If you have any questions about this concept, please come and see me.